Francisco Monaldi is a fellow in Latin American energy policy with the Baker Institute at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And Michael Penfold is a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Latin American program and is a full professor of political economy and governance at IESA Business and Public Policy School in Caracas, Venezuela. Gentlemen, welcome to the Wilson Center, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
I know our guests are going to be here for this two-day conference that's taking place that is examining Russia's involvement in the Venezuela crisis. And so we want to begin by defining the Venezuela crisis. You know, this becomes this shorthand that everyone uses in a way that perhaps requires an update. So if I can begin with you, Michael, what's the current status of the so-called crisis?
The Venezuelan crisis has several dimensions to it. On the political dimension, we're talking about the breakdown of democracy and the rule of law in Venezuela, which is a real concern in a region where most of the countries in Latin America have become full democracies. It also has a social or humanitarian aspect to the crisis. We're at this point seeing above 90% of the population living in poverty levels, over 50% in extreme poverty. And Venezuela is creating a huge immigration pressure over border countries such as Brazil and Colombia. And finally, the Venezuelan crisis has to do with the ability of the Western Hemisphere to deal with a political, a social, and an economic crisis that has an enormous impact in the region, and where the government, and particularly the Chavismo regime and Maduro himself, have proven tremendously resilient even against both economic and individual sanctions.
And pressures from within and without.
Right, and I think this is a real challenge that the Venezuelan crisis poses for the Latin American region and for the U.S. in particular.
Michael describes multi-facets to the crisis, whether political or economic and others. Francisco, is it possible to sort of discern the chicken from the egg? What comes first? Where did the problems begin in Venezuela?
It's hard. I mean, without a doubt, the Chavez administration before Maduro started, concentrating power in the hands of the executive and eroding, democracy, and that was combined with a very significant increase in the price of oil. He had a lot of money, and he, used a lot of that money to, buy political support, but at the same time, it allowed him to make huge economic mistakes. So in a way, the lack of democracy magnified, the big policy blunders that the Chavez administration made, that we are seeing the consequence today. And in particular, for example, in oil, Venezuela depends totally on oil, more than 90% of exports, but production has collapsed. It has collapsed to less than half what it was when Chavez came to power, but during Maduro, it has fallen by about a third. So that is that collapse in the national oil company and oil production is partly a result of all this model, but it is also generating the consequences of the crisis today.
Mm-hmm. So which brings us to Russia and its involvement. From the Venezuelan perspective, how important is Russia as an ally?
Well, Russia has become a very important ally for the Chavismo regime, in part because it's a source of support in many different fronts. On the financial front, in the last few years, particularly in the last 2 years, it's become the most important government, providing fresh financing both to the state, to the government, and to PDVSA, even above the Chinese, which have also been extremely involved in Venezuela. In terms of the size of those loans, the Chinese remain more important, but the Russians have been more willing to come as a last resource of bailout, particularly for the oil industry. It's also extremely important since over 15 years ago in terms of providing military equipment, technology. Mm-hmm. And it's now also providing a different kind of assistance to Venezuela, which is related to helping the government in terms of political advisory, particularly using big data for political purposes, and also in using technology, in particularly cryptocurrencies, as a way to bypass sanctions in order to make payments. And therefore, Russia has become a very, very important partner for the Maduro regime in Venezuela.
How effective has that circumvention of sanctions been?
No, not really. I mean, in part because Venezuela is an oil economy, and almost 96% of our exports are oil related. And this is an industry that is very intensive in raising capital and using the financial sector. And therefore, sanctions have hurt in very important ways to an industry that was already in distress before the sanctions appeared, but that have made it more difficult for the oil company to raise the necessary capital to run the industry and avoid and at least stabilize production, which they haven't been able to do so far.
Francisco, your thoughts on how much Venezuela must rely on Russia?
Yeah, well, as Michael said, one of the key areas in which Russia has become heavily involved is in the oil industry, both as prepaying the oil that Venezuela exports around between 200 and 250,000 barrels of oil of Venezuela. Of course, Russia doesn't need Venezuelan oil. They export plenty of oil, but Venezuela has to repay it to Rosneft. Mm-hmm. And Rosneft has become one of the biggest players in the country, along with Chevron and CNPC. They currently operate about 10% of Venezuela's production. But more than that, they recently have acquired a lot of additional projects in which they still have not invested, but that give them a very significant presence in the Venezuela's hydrocarbon sector. And of course, there is some people argue, is it an economic play or is it a geopolitical play? I think it might be a mix of both because at this point the Venezuelan government is so desperate that they are willing to give up assets at a very attractive price. On the other hand, there is clearly, there seems to be a geopolitical component. And one interesting thing is that the company itself is playing a very heavy political role, the national company of Russia, Rosneft. So a lot of the relationship is not managed through the regular channels of the foreign ministries of the two countries, but through the national oil companies.
Very few relationships in life between either individuals or countries are perfectly 50-50. Given the geopolitical aspect of this, you have a symmetry, two countries that are finding themselves increasingly isolated from the rest of the international community for a variety of reasons. Is there an imbalance here? Does one country need the other more than the other between Venezuela and Russia?
Well, without a doubt, Venezuela needs Russia much more than the other way around. Basically, Venezuela is broke. It's in default. It's going to probably be in full-blown default this year, and the Russians have been a lifeline in the last few years. It's unclear if they are willing to expose themselves more in Venezuela. What they are doing now is more limited in the sense that, as I said, they acquire assets, but they are not necessarily putting additional money on it. So it is unlikely they will add fresh money at this point. Particularly, they don't want to add money so that it's paid to Wall Street. But I think without a doubt, Venezuela is going to become increasingly dependent on Russia for marketing Venezuelan oil, for technical help in the oil industry. And China will also play a role, but without a doubt, Russia will play a very prominent role.
Russia's benefit's harder to put a price tag on in the sense that it's not a hard economic crisis, but Russia is relying on Venezuela to have a footprint and a presence in the region.
Well, Russia is leveraging on the Venezuelan crisis to show that...
Leveraging or exploiting?
Well, I think they're both. They're both doing, they're leveraging on the one hand because they're gaining access to key assets. Mm-hmm. And they're also exploiting the crisis in terms of using it to show that their influence goes beyond its natural areas of influence, namely Asia or the Middle East, and it has some influence in Latin America, where in fact they used to play a very important role under the Soviet Union in Cuba, and now Venezuela has become an interesting platform to show that kind of influence. I think at the end Venezuela is gaining, and more than Venezuela, the Maduro regime is gaining an option, a hope, which is that Russia can play a very important role in terms of helping the government stabilize oil production and even increase oil production, and therefore reduce their dependence of the U.S. market, particularly in it not only in terms of as a market, but as a country where Venezuela refines a large portion of its oil. So, and this is something that I think is probably overblown. I don't think that Russia will be able to do that, because the amounts of resources, of financial resources that Russia would need to invest in the oil industry and to help stabilize the Venezuelan economy are so large that the risk exposure would be very high. But in terms of the political gains, I think they're substantial.
How do the neighbors of Venezuela react to its relationship with Russia? Does this help or hurt closeness to Russia?
Well, I think it's a source of concern. I think Latin America is starting to get used to the fact that there are other powers beyond the U.S. that are playing a large role in terms of as an investor. For example, China. China has become the most important among them, the most important foreign direct investors in Latin America, not only in Venezuela but also in Mexico or Brazil, Argentina, Peru. And therefore, the region is becoming used to the idea that a foreign investment comes beyond the U.S. and Europe from Asia. I think Russia is still of a newcomer, and to be very honest, I think it's as a global power. It's one that power is not coming from economic growth. It's not coming from innovation, and as China is. So therefore, I think that the influence of Russia in Latin America is very limited, and it's going to continue to be very limited, particularly to those areas where they think they can leverage in terms of showing that their influence goes is penetrating the Western Hemisphere.
Francisco, with that in mind, with the limitations of what Russia can actually do for Venezuela and the level of desperation you describe in talking about Venezuela's crisis, is it a good idea to continue to put your eggs into the Russian basket, or what should Venezuela be doing?
Well, the thing is that, as Michael suggests, the regime, as long as they are not willing to negotiate with, the U.S., Europe, and the other Latin American countries that are pushing them to go back to, some constitutional government, then they have to rely on these other partners. In particular, in the case of the oil industry, if the U.S. continues increasing sanctions, and with the sanctions already in place, it's significantly affecting the oil industry, they will have to totally rely. And by the way, the default also will be a problem, because if Venezuela defaults, a lot of the creditors will try to seize assets, seize cargo ships, etc. So what is likely to happen is that Chinese and Russian companies will take control over the Venezuelan oil industry. That has an advantage for them, and it's a problem for Venezuela. And as you point out, in terms of concentrating power in just a couple of factors, because they will get repaid from the loans that they have given to Venezuela with the marketing of the Venezuelan oil, and they will probably take control over a lot of the industry itself. So it will be a total reliance, but as other countries that have been isolated from the rest of the international community, like Cuba, Venezuela seems to have few options, and China is not apparently willing to play the role that Russia still seems willing to play.
Final thought, gentlemen, about sort of where this is all headed. And I'm not asking you to make predictions as much as identify for us things you'll be watching, indicators that might tell us how things are trending.
Well, in the area that I follow, which is the oil industry, I think it will be really relevant to see what the U.S. does in terms of sanctions. There are two on the table, two possible options that the Trump administration is considering. One is the banning the import of Venezuelan oil. The other one is banning the export of products and diluents that are needed for extra heavy oil in Venezuela from the U.S. and also insurance, banning insurance of the cargo, the oil cargo out of Venezuela. If those sanctions are imposed, that will further corner Venezuela, will make default much more imminent and full-blown, in the sense that they will not be able to even pay PDVSA debt versus the debt of the government, which they are trying to do now. And as a result of that, the isolation of Venezuela will grow dramatically, and as I mentioned, they will have to rely on these two potential allies. A different scenario will be one in which some of the fractures that are inside the government coalition in Venezuela lead to some sort of opening or transition in which there is some possibility of negotiating some lifting of sanctions or some changes in Venezuela. That will open a set of other alternatives.
How likely is that second idea, that some political change?
At this point, I think it's unlikely. It's not something that I will assign more than 15% or so.
Final thoughts on sort of the trend lines, where are the things you'll be watching, indicators that might give us some sense of potential breakthroughs or where things may be headed?
I think a political change is a real factor that might help the country move in a different economic direction. This is a country that needs to stabilize its economy, needs to access funds from multilateral organizations, needs to re-access again capital markets. It needs to re-establish its relationship with China in a different way, and this can only happen with a political change, which seems unlikely, and it seems unlikely because so far the government has been unwilling to come up with changes in the institutional framework, in particularly in reestablishing the National Assembly, and the ability of the opposition to work in a normal democratic political framework. So far, the cost of that lack of change has been huge. I mean, we've lost almost half of our GDP. During the Chavez era, while Chavez was alive, the country experienced very high oil prices, and thanks to very high oil prices and also high levels of indebtedness, the country was able to reduce poverty levels in significant ways. Well, in less than 4 years, we've lost all of those gains, and not only that, we're in worse position than we were 20 years ago when Chavez came into power. So at the end, the governance problem in Venezuela, I think, is a key aspect of the crisis, and whether Venezuela is going to be able to come up with a solution to that situation, well, it's going to require some kind of negotiation or a process of political change that could turn out to be extremely conflictive and violent.
On that ominous note, I want to thank you for joining us today and sharing your insights. And let those of you watching know that if you'd like to learn more, both of our guests are here as part of this two-day conference that I mentioned. They'll be doing a longer panel discussion that will be available on both the Kennan Institute and the Latin American Programs website in a couple days. So, gentlemen, again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.